Raphael arrived home long after the city had quieted. The mansion perched above the hills like a luminous ship floating in the darkness. From the car window he saw the familiar cascade of lights along the driveway, the ornamental trees trimmed into obedient shapes, the water of the central fountain catching the last glimmers of traffic from below. The driver opened his door, and a gust of cooler night air slipped into the car, carrying with it the faint smell of wet grass and distant exhaust, a reminder that the city where he had once wandered barefoot still waited at the base of the hill. He stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt with the automatic gesture of a man used to tailored fabrics and tight schedules. The security lights followed him as he crossed the gravel, their pale beams gliding over the polished stone steps and the carved double doors that had once impressed him and now simply represented another barrier to cross before reaching a few hours of sleep. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and fresh flowers, the combination his fiancée preferred when visiting. A vase of white lilies dominated the entrance hall table, their petals open and immaculate, arranged by a florist Beatrice had personally chosen for the wedding. The reminder of the event, now only weeks away, pressed itself into his thoughts like a hand on his shoulder, insistent and heavy. Footsteps echoed softly from the corridor that led toward the guest suites. It was late for staff to still be working upstairs. By this hour, most of the maids had finished and withdrawn to the service wing. Curious rather than irritated, Raphael followed the sound, his shoes muted by the thick runner that covered the marble. At the far end of the hallway, where a line of wall sconces bathed the white panels in a warm, forgiving light, a young woman stood on a small ladder, dusting the intricate molding near the ceiling. She moved with a careful economy, as if measuring each gesture so nothing would fall or break. The handle of the feather duster anchored firmly in her hand while the other steadied herself against the wall. She wore the simple uniform all his employees in the house shared, the dark dress and white apron that erased personal style and reduced each body to function. Even so, something about the straight line of her back and the delicate strength of her wrists resisted anonymity. A stray wisp of hair had escaped from the bun at the nape of her neck and clung to her cheek with a stubborn curl. As he approached, she sensed his presence, the way people who spend their lives in other people's houses learn to read currents of air and energy. She climbed down the last 2 steps of the ladder quickly, turning to face him with her eyes lowered in automatic deference, hands folding together. It was in that simple motion that he saw the ring. It was nothing special by the standards of the life he lived now, just a thin band of metal darkened by years of wear, the sort of trinket sold at street markets and forgotten in drawers. On the hand of a maid in his house, it should have been invisible, swallowed by the absence of diamonds and brand names. Yet Raphael felt the hallway narrow around him as his gaze fixed on that modest circle. The smooth line of the metal, the small scratch near the side, even the way it sat on her finger, a fraction loose, were all so precisely familiar that for a second he thought exhaustion was playing with his mind. A memory, long buried under contracts and meetings and photographs for magazines, pushed against the surface of his thoughts. The crowded corridor of an old building, the echo of children's voices, the smell of soup and damp mattresses. A boy's hand trembling as he slipped a ring exactly like this one onto a girl's finger, promising her something he didn't yet understand but believed with all the blind intensity of scarcity. Raphael forced his eyes to her face, but she kept her gaze fixed on a point somewhere near his chest, the professional distance of someone accustomed to being looked at without truly being seen. From where she stood, the details of his suit, the gleam of his watch, the faint line of fatigue around his mouth formed a studied image of power at the end of a long day. She felt his stare thickening the air between them, lingering not on her expression but on her hand, and instinctively she curled her fingers, as if she could hide the ring inside her palm. In houses like this, any personal object could be read as a statement, an intrusion of private life into the controlled landscape of polished surfaces. She had learned to keep her stories to herself, to move quietly, to erase footsteps before they were even heard. Now, with his attention heavy on that worn band of metal, an old unease stirred, the familiar fear that anything about her might be judged out of place. He cleared his throat, the small sound breaking the invisible thread stretching between his gaze and her hand. A conventional phrase of thanks came to his lips, something about her working late, but it emerged muted, as if spoken from another room. She nodded without lifting her eyes, stepped aside to let him pass, and the faint rustle of her apron followed him down the corridor like a shy, persistent echo. By the time he reached his study, the house had settled into its hush, the clink of dishes fading away. He asked Dona Lucia to bring him the file of the new maid, his tone casual, his heartbeat not. When he read the name Helena on the paper, the past pressed closer, yet he could not tell if it was memory or recognition guiding him. Raphael closed the study door behind him with a muted click and leaned against it for a second longer than necessary, as if the polished wood could steady what had been shaken inside him in the corridor. The house fell away on the other side of that door. The footsteps of staff, the hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen, the occasional muted ring of his phone forgotten in his jacket. Here, the air was thicker, scented with old paper and leather, the heavy curtains swallowing the city lights so that only the green banker's lamp on his desk carved out a pool of color. On the blotter, where contracts and balance sheets usually waited for his signature, lay a single beige folder. The label was written in the tidy, impersonal handwriting of the human resources assistant, Helena, temporary domestic staff. The ordinariness of the words did not match the tremor that had started low in his chest. He crossed the room slowly, every step measured, as though approaching something alive and skittish that might bolt if he moved too fast. Sitting, he opened the folder with the same care he used for documents worth millions. A photocopied ID, a form listing her date of birth, address, references, emergency contacts. His eyes slid past the numbers and lines until they caught on the name, printed twice, once in full, once signed in her own hand. Helena. The letters swam for a moment, blurring as if he had suddenly stepped from bright sunlight into a dim church. He felt the familiar chair under him, the polished arms smooth against his palms, and yet an invisible weight pressed against his ribs, forcing the air out. Helena. It was not a common name, not to him. It was a single, sharp note plucked from a melody he had spent years trying not to hum. The ring he had seen in the hallway had already unsettled him. In that brief encounter, when he watched the light all but vanish against the thin, worn band on her finger, something in his memory had stirred like a child turning in its sleep. Now, with the name anchoring that flash of recognition, the past rose not as a series of tidy images but as smells, sounds, fragments of phrases. The study, with its dark wood shelves and silent, obedient books, began to dissolve, replaced by peeling walls the color of old bandages and a corridor that smelled of boiled beans and disinfectant. He was small again, his shoes too big because they had belonged to someone else first, their rubber soles squeaking against the cracked tiles of the orphanage. Children's voices bounced off the walls, laughter and crying layered together until they became a single, constant noise. Overcrowded rooms where beds were too few and blankets too thin, where privacy was an unknown luxury and possessions were counted not in objects, but in small certainties like a corner of mattress that was always yours. That was where he had first seen her, a thin girl with hair cut bluntly at the shoulders, sitting cross-legged on the floor beneath a window that did not quite close, tracing a crack in the wall with one finger as if following the line of a map. She had looked up when his shadow interrupted the thin rectangle of light and had offered him half a dry piece of bread without a word. Later, he would think of that gesture whenever people praised his generosity in elegant dining rooms, and he would know that what they admired in him had been taught to him by someone who had nothing. They had eaten that hardened bread together in silence, their backs against the same wall, as around them other children argued over broken toys or fell asleep mid-conversation from sheer exhaustion. Nights were the worst. The building groaned with the weight of so many restless bodies. The thin mattresses exhaled the sour smell of old sweat. Somewhere a child coughed until their breath hitched. Somewhere else someone cried quietly into their pillow, hoping the sound would be swallowed by the dark. On those nights, when the fear of never belonging to anyone settled heavy as the damp air, Raphael would find his way to the narrow bed where Helena lay curled on her side. He would sit on the edge, careful not to wake the girl on the other side, and whisper clumsy stories of houses with gardens and families who always came back when they left. She would answer with small pieces of truth, how she remembered a woman's hands braiding her hair, a song about the sea, a name she was not sure had been real. When the nightmares tightened around his throat, it was her hand that reached out in the dark, fingers tangling with his, sharing warmth more effectively than the thin blanket ever could. The day of the ring had been like any other, and yet it stood apart, bright in his memory. They had been led out into the courtyard after lunch, the sun merciless on the cracked concrete, the older boys kicking a flattened ball while the younger ones watched, waiting to be invited into the game or the fight, whichever came first. Beyond the rusted gate, through the bars, a narrow street pulsed with life. Vendors pushed carts of fruit that glowed in colors he had only ever seen in magazines. A man with a tray of cheap trinkets shouted his wares, the metallic clatter of rings and chains punctuating his calls. Raphael had pressed himself against the bars, his fingers wrapping around the flaking paint, eyes locked on the thin circles of metal that caught the light. Something had settled in him in that moment, a stubborn, childlike certainty that he could change at least one thing in their world. He had no money, of course. What he had were favors. A week of voluntarily washing the dishes, an afternoon spent helping the cook peel potatoes, a promise to take the blame the next time a window was broken. Small trades, extracted and offered like treasures, until the cook's heart softened and she slipped a few coins into his hand, muttering that it was for shoes or a book, something useful. Instead, with the stealth of the guilty and the righteousness of the desperate, he had waited for a moment when the sister on duty was distracted and then darted through the half-open gate, his pulse thundering in his ears. At the vendor's side, the world seemed too bright, the man's voice too loud. Raphael pointed at the simplest ring, a plain band with a tiny scratch near the edge. It fit the coins in his pocket and the dream in his chest. Back in the courtyard, breathless and triumphant, he had pulled Helena into the thin shade of a struggling tree. His hands shook as he pressed the ring into her palm. She had stared at it as if afraid it might vanish, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and terror. He had swallowed, feeling the weight of all the words he didn't know how to say. So he chose the ones that had formed themselves in his mind in countless restless nights. "One day, when I'm rich, I'll marry you," he had declared, his voice low but certain, as if saying it firmly enough could bend the future to his will. For a second, neither of them breathed. Then she had smiled, a small, fragile curve of the lips that contained more faith than any prayer he had heard in the orphanage chapel, and held out her hand so he could slide the ring onto her finger. The memory shifted abruptly after that, like a film reel cutting to a new scene. The day the wealthy couple came, his world had fractured without warning. There had been hurried whispers among the adults, glances in his direction that felt like measurements being taken, papers signed in an office that smelled of ink and furniture polish. The man in the suit shaking his hand too firmly, the woman's perfume floral and overwhelming as she smoothed his hair. He remembered searching the crowded room with his eyes for Helena, but she had been on laundry duty, or perhaps sent on some errand. No one seemed to know. The decision had already been made. A suitcase he didn't own had been packed with clothes that weren't his. Hands guided him into a car he had never ridden in before. Through the rear window, the orphanage shrank rapidly, the gate a rusted mouth closing. He had pressed his face to the glass, stomach twisting, the ring on Helena's finger burning in his mind like a small, distant flame that he was being driven away from at terrifying speed. In the new house, everything was soft where his old life had been hard, quiet where it had been deafening. Carpets ate the sound of his footsteps, doors closed without slamming, and the adults spoke in measured tones even when they were angry. At night, the bed was his alone, the blanket thick, the air smelling of lavender rather than mold. He should have slept better, but his body, trained to the rhythm of the orphanage, remained tense. Guilt seeped into the spaces comfort could not occupy. He told himself he would write, that once he learned the address he would find a way to send letters, to return with gifts, to keep the promise he had placed so carelessly, so earnestly on Helena's small hand. But the days folded into weeks, then months. Tutors filled his afternoons, new rules filled his head. When he once gathered the courage to ask about visiting the orphanage, the cool silence that followed, The gentle yet firm explanation that it was better to focus on his new life settled over his determination like a blanket smothering a flame. As the years went by, he learned new languages, new manners, new ways of moving through rooms that had never known hunger. The memory of the orphanage became something soft-edged and distant, like a film he had watched long ago. When images of Helena surfaced, her laughing at some shared joke, her hand gripping his under the covers during a storm, he pushed them aside with the discipline he now applied to everything. It had been a childish promise made between two abandoned kids. Life had intervened as it always did. He told himself she would have forgotten too, found her own path, maybe even laughed at the idea that they had ever believed such a thing possible. Now, decades and fortunes later, that same Helena was in his house, pushing a dust cloth over shelves that held signed first editions he would never read twice. The ring he had once purchased with stolen coins and borrowed favors still clung to her finger, as persistent as the memory he had tried to drown in success. The irony, the cruelty, the strange symmetry of it all twisted inside him. He closed the folder gently, the paper making a soft rustle that sounded disproportionately loud in the quiet study. His first instinct was to call her in, to demand explanations, to ask whether she had kept the ring as a joke, as an accusation, or as something else entirely. But another feeling rose just as quickly, heavier and more cautious. Fear. Not fear of her or of scandal, but of facing the boy he had been and the promises he had abandoned. If he opened this door now, every carefully arranged piece of his life would have to accommodate the truth of who he had left behind. He leaned back in the chair, letting his head rest against the leather, eyes closed. The air conditioning hummed softly, maintaining a temperature that never fluctuated, unlike the heat and cold of his childhood. Outside, somewhere in the sleeping city, traffic lights changed for cars that did not come. In the service quarters, Helena was probably folding uniforms or lying on a narrow bed, unaware that her name had just cracked open a sealed part of his heart. Raphael inhaled deeply and exhaled slowly, as if releasing the urge to act on impulse. For now, he decided he would keep his recognition to himself. He needed time to understand what seeing her again truly awakened in him, beyond nostalgia and guilt. The past had found its way back into his life without asking permission. He would not rush forward blindly to meet it. With deliberate care, he placed the folder back on the desk, turned off the green lamp, and let darkness reclaim the room, carrying with him the quiet knowledge that nothing in his house, or in him, was quite the same as it had been that morning. Helena's days began before the first tram screeched along the avenue. Her phone vibrated on the crate she used as a bedside table, its dull light drawing a pale rectangle on the peeling wall. For a few seconds she lay still, feeling the ache in her hands before she even flexed her fingers. The skin was rough, the knuckles slightly swollen, the small cuts from cleaning products stinging where the sheet brushed them. In the next room, her aunt coughed, that dry, stubborn sound that had become part of the apartment's soundtrack. Helena swung her feet to the cold floor, whispered a greeting through the half-open door, and was answered by a tired smile and a joking complaint about the hour. In the narrow kitchen she brewed coffee strong enough to wake saints, sliced one piece of bread, then divided it in two equal halves without thinking. Her aunt ate slowly, wrapped in a shawl despite the mild weather, watching Helena the way people watch what they cannot afford to lose. Back in her small room, Helena dressed in the dark uniform that had become her second skin. She buttoned it carefully, smoothing invisible creases, as if neatness could shield her from the uncertainties waiting beyond the door. On the chip dresser, a small plastic box held the few pieces of jewelry she had managed to collect over the years. A pair of fake pearl earrings, a thin chain with no pendant. She rarely wore them. What she never removed was the simple ring encircling her finger. It caught the pale morning light without sparkle, just a dull sheen over metal too cheap to impress anyone in the houses where she worked. As always, her thumb moved toward it, hesitated, gripped it gently. If she twisted, the ring would slide off with little resistance. She had tried often enough to know. Yet every attempt ended the same way. A sudden tightening in her throat, a rush of images of concrete corridors and metal beds, and she would let go as if the ring were the only solid thing keeping that past from being erased completely. She told herself that it remained on her hand not as a promise to another person, but as loyalty to the girl she once was, the one who had dared to believe someone saw a future for her. On the crowded bus climbing toward the rich hillside, Helena stood pressed between other uniforms, one hand gripping the metal bar, the other resting lightly against the bag that carried her lunch and a change of shoes. From the smeared window, she watched the city transform itself. Graffiti-stained walls gave way to freshly painted facades, small shops to glass-fronted boutiques, plastic chairs on sidewalks to wrought iron gates guarding driveways. The air itself seemed to change, less heavy with fried food and exhaust, scented instead with watered gardens and the faint sweetness of expensive detergent wafting from open windows. She had traveled this route for other houses, other employers, but the name tied to today's destination still sat differently in her mind. When the agency first mentioned Raphael's surname, she had looked away quickly, hiding her reaction behind practiced composure. Beneath that calm, something small and stubborn had twisted, half disbelief, half a bitter amusement at the coincidences life allowed itself. She already knew his face before she passed through the mansion's gates for the first time. It stared back at her from newspapers her aunt borrowed, from television reports playing in shop windows, from glowing screens on the bus when someone scrolled through the news. They called him powerful, brilliant, relentless, a man who had climbed from hardship to the glittering world of finance and philanthropy. No report ever mentioned the crowded dormitories, the shared sandwiches, the whispered stories told in the half-dark to chase away fear. Helena did not expect them to. Those memories belonged to another country, one he seemed to have left without a backward glance. The first time she saw him in person, crossing the entrance hall with a file under his arm and his attention fixed on his phone, she recognized the posture before the face, the measured stride, the way his shoulders no longer curled inward as they once had against the cold. She felt no rush of romance, no triumphant sense of destiny fulfilled, only the sober confirmation of something she had understood the day she left the orphanage for her aunt's cramped apartment. He had not come back, and life had continued without him. If a trace of that forgotten promise still pulsed in her somewhere, it had been wrapped carefully in layers of practicality. What mattered now were numbers written on scraps of paper on the kitchen table. Rent, electricity, medication, bus fares. The salary from the mansion, while insignificant to those who owned it, would mean her aunt's inhalers on time, an occasional piece of fruit that was not the cheapest in the market, a little margin between them and disaster. Helena had cleaned many homes in many neighborhoods, had seen how easily people with more rooms than they could count complained about inconveniences that to her would have sounded like luxuries. Resentment tempted her sometimes, but it never stayed long. It required energy she preferred to spend on survival. In Raphael's home she would be, she decided, exactly what the uniform said she was. A worker who arrived, did her tasks well, and left at the end of the day with as little trace as possible. She would keep the ring, not as a plea to the man who owned the house, but as a quiet relic of the girl who once believed herself worth a promise. That memory steadied her when fatigue weighed on her arms and bleach burned her throat. She would work hard, stay small in his eyes, and let dignity be her shield, carrying her silent strength through corridors where her heart would remain carefully, deliberately, her own, both awake and safe. The mansion had settled into the rhythm of a small, self-contained universe, one where the clocks were set not by the city outside but by Raphael's schedule, the florist's deliveries, the arrival of the caterer with samples for the wedding menu. Morning light slipped in through tall windows and fell on polished floors that never knew dust for more than a few minutes, on paintings chosen by decorators, on vases of flowers that were changed before they even began to wilt. In this universe, each room had an unspoken purpose and every person a defined orbit. The driver waited near the garage, always close to the car but never to the family. The cook ruled the kitchen like a seasoned general, commanding pots and pans instead of soldiers. Maids moved through corridors with measured steps, eyes trained to notice fingerprints on glass and cushions out of alignment, yet trained too to avoid lingering where they might be seen as anything more than part of the furniture. Even silence had its own hierarchy. The respectful quiet in the family rooms, the cautious whispering in the servants' wing, the heavy stillness of Raphael's study when he worked late into the night, his presence the invisible gravity that held the entire structure together. Beatrice entered this world as if it belonged to her by right, heels clicking on the marble with the ease of someone raised in houses where echoes had always answered her steps. The staff knew the sound now. It meant the fiancé had arrived, bringing with her a cloud of expensive perfume and the rustle of garment bags. She came often these days, swatches of fabric folded over her arm, folders of printed seating plans under one hand, her phone in the other, buzzing with messages from florists, photographers, and friends asking about dress codes. Her beauty was the kind that photographs loved. Sleek hair, careful makeup, a ring on her finger whose stone caught light in dazzling bursts whenever she gestured. At first, she had glided through the mansion's rooms with easy enthusiasm, holding up samples of ivory lace to the light, teasing Raphael about color schemes. Lately, however, something in her had sharpened. She watched him more closely, her smile thinning whenever his gaze drifted toward the windows or the ceiling instead of the floral arrangements spread on the dining room table. His distraction showed in small, telling moments. The way he reread the same page of a contract, the phone calls he ended abruptly, the fixed half-smile he wore when she spoke of guest lists. When she slipped her arm through his and asked if he was excited, his answer came a fraction too late, as though pulled from a distance. It was during one of those visits that Beatrice first really saw Helena. The maid had been there before, of course, passing discreetly with a tray or a feather duster, the kind of presence Beatrice's world was trained to acknowledge without truly noticing. That afternoon, though, as Beatrice stood with Raphael in the hallway, debating whether the wedding photos would look better in the garden or on the grand staircase, Helena emerged from a side door carrying a stack of freshly laundered towels. Her head was bent, her steps silent on the carpet, the towels forming a white barrier between her and the conversations of people who could decide her future without learning her name. Raphael's eyes flickered toward the movement, drawn by habit more than intention, and then down, unbidden, to the slim hand gripping the top towel. The modest ring glinted, a small, worn circle against work-reddened skin. Beatrice followed his gaze with the sharp intuition of someone accustomed to reading the slightest shifts in expression. She saw the way he seemed, just for an instant, to lose the thread of their discussion, the faint tightening of his jaw before he forced his attention back to her. That brief, seemingly insignificant exchange of glances, half completed, settled in her mind with disproportionate weight. In Beatrice's world, jewelry carried meanings as clear as labels on wine bottles. Engagement rings shouted commitments, heirloom bracelets murmured of lineage, and even simple pieces were strategically chosen accents. The band on the maid's finger, however, spoke of another language. Not fashion, but attachment. It looked out of place in this house where every object was curated, and that very incongruity made it noticeable. Beatrice told herself she was being rational when, later, she mentioned it to Raphael's mother over tea in the smaller sitting room. She described the moment lightly, framing it as a fleeting concern, a woman's instinct sharpened by love. Yet beneath the practiced calm of her words lay a less generous undercurrent, one shaped by years of learning where everyone was supposed to stand. A maid was background, a maid with a ring that did not match her uniform, attracting the attention of a man like Raphael, disturbed the quiet lines of the picture. Raphael's mother listened, fingers wrapped around her cup, her posture as elegant as always, but her gaze darkened almost imperceptibly. She had long suspected that part of her son's heart remained anchored somewhere in the life he never spoke about, in those years before adoption that his new surname had supposedly erased. The idea that a shadow from that world might now be walking through her house, wearing a ring and eliciting looks from him he did not offer his fiancée, touched a deep nerve. Between the two women, a subtle agreement formed without needing to be spoken. They did not rail or accuse. That was not how their class handled unease. Instead, they wrapped their apprehension in vocabulary about propriety, discretion, and the importance of the family's image, letting those words do the work of older, cruder prejudices. It was not that a maid was bad. They would have insisted only that boundaries needed to be clear, that appearances mattered in their circles, that Raphael, with his history of charity projects and unconventional decisions, sometimes needed gentle guidance to keep him from making choices that might be misunderstood. Neither of them sought Helena out to ask who she was, what her story might be, whether there was any truth to the suspicion beginning to take shape. They did not need facts. In their world, intuition supported by gossip often felt more reliable than anything written on a staff form. And so, gradually, a soft mistrust began to cling to Helena's figure in their minds, like a shadow lengthening at the end of the afternoon. In the servants' quarters, where the wallpaper peeled and the light bulbs were older than in the family's wing, the same events were being interpreted through another lens. Their gossip was a survival tool as much as entertainment, a way for those at the bottom of the hierarchy to map the shifting moods of those above. A driver had seen Raphael looking at Helena's file one night. The cook had noticed the silence that fell in the kitchen when Helena entered after having been summoned upstairs. A younger maid had caught the faint tremor in Helena's hands when the subject of her new assignment arose. Details, small and easily dismissed on their own, began to link together in whispered conversations over buckets and basins. Someone suggested they might have known each other before. Someone else pointed out that Helena never spoke about past employers, that she seemed older in her silences than her age on paper suggested. The ring was mentioned often, its plain band elevated in the retellings into a symbol heavy with romance, betrayal, or both, depending on the storyteller's mood. Helena, for her part, responded to the rising curiosity with the same quiet reserve she brought to every task. She did not confirm, did not deny, simply folded towels and polished glasses with a concentration that left no space for questions to land. Raphael moved through this charged atmosphere as if crossing an elegant room whose floor he knew was cracked beneath the carpet. He could feel the shift in the air when he entered the dining room and sensed Beatrice's eyes measuring not only him but the spaces his gaze traveled through. He heard the careful choice of words in his mother's voice when she casually remarked on the importance of trustworthy staff, on the need to replace anyone who might be a source of distraction during such an important time. In the corners of corridors, conversations stopped a second too late, leaving him with the echo of his own name wrapped around phrases like, the new maid, and from before. At his desk, documents blurred in front of him as memories and present concerns collided. The life his adoptive family had curated for him unfolded with predictable precision. An advantageous marriage, a respectable image, a future that fit neatly into the expectations of their world. Yet, walking those same halls now was a living reminder of another path, one that had been abruptly severed and never properly acknowledged. Pretending not to recognize Helena had seemed, at first, like an act of protection. For her, for himself, for the fragile fabric of this carefully built life. But as glances turned into questions and silence into suspicion, that pretense began to feel less like prudence and more like cowardice. One evening, standing alone at a window overlooking the manicured garden, the city's lights shimmering distantly below, he understood with an uncomfortable clarity that ignoring her was not making the past disappear. It was allowing others to write their own version of it. He exhaled slowly, accepting that he would have to step out of the role prepared for him and face the unfinished story walking his halls, not as rumor or threat, but as a truth he could no longer keep locked away. All morning, Raphael postponed the moment, hiding behind emails and calls, letting his assistant stack yet another file on the corner of the desk he was not really seeing. The study, usually his refuge of logic and numbers, felt smaller today, the air more dense, as if the books lining the walls were witnesses waiting to see whether he would choose courage or continue hiding. Outside the windows, the garden was bright and controlled, hedges trimmed to precise shapes, while inside him memories grew wild, climbing over every attempt to concentrate. He had asked Dona Lucia, in his usual even tone, to send Helena to him when she finished with the upstairs rooms, mentioning something vague about a review of her duties. It was the kind of pretext no one would question. Employers summoned maids all the time in that house, for tasks, for complaints, for instructions muttered in low voices that carried the weight of someone else's comfort. Only he knew that this summons had nothing to do with dust or schedules, and everything to do with a thin ring of cheap metal that had turned his well-ordered world slightly off its axis. When the knock finally came, soft and hesitant against the solid wood. His answer caught in his throat a heartbeat before emerging. Helena stepped inside with the contained posture of someone accustomed to entering rooms that were not hers. Eyes lowered, hands lightly joined in front of her apron as if making herself smaller might make her safer. The study's lamplight softened the lines of her face, but did nothing to hide the tension in her jaw or the faint swelling of skin roughened by detergents. For a second he saw not the maid standing obediently before his desk, but the girl who had once sat on a cracked concrete step sharing a bruised apple with him, knees touching because there had been nowhere else to sit. Her name rose to his lips before he could dress it in titles, shaped exactly as he used to whisper it in the dark dormitory when the younger children's crying kept her awake. The sound of it, stripped of distance and formality, crossed the space between them and landed on her like an unexpected touch. For a brief, unguarded moment Helena's eyes lifted, and he saw recognition flare there, raw and incredulous, softening the practiced neutrality of her expression. It was gone the next instant, shuttered behind lowered lashes, as she straightened almost imperceptibly and answered him with a single word that placed them back inside their assigned roles. "Sir." The title slid between them like a pane of glass, transparent yet impenetrable. Raphael felt the sting of it, not because it was inappropriate, but because of how right it was, how completely it erased the nights when they had been nothing but two children trying to convince each other that hunger and fear were temporary. For a moment he almost retreated into the pretext, reaching for the paper on his desk that listed her assigned rooms, ready to comment on routine, to protect himself with the ordinary. Instead, he drew a breath that seemed to scrape his lungs on the way in and spoke of the one thing neither of them could pretend not to remember. He mentioned the orphanage without embellishment, his voice low and steady, naming the chipped plates, the smell of damp clothes never quite dry, the line of metal beds where sleep came late and left early. He spoke of the nights when her hand had found his under a thin blanket, of the whispered promises that they would grow up, leave that place, and never again feel their stomachs clench with emptiness. His gaze dropped, unbidden, to the ring on her finger, that modest circle that had survived more years than many marriages he had seen announced and dissolved in glossy magazines. He remembered, aloud now, the afternoon he had slipped out through the half-open gate to buy it from a street vendor, trading his fear of punishment for the thrill of placing something that was entirely his choice onto her hand. He repeated the words he had said then, words that had seemed so simple coming from the mouth of a boy who owned nothing. "One day, when I'm rich, I'll marry you." Each recollection he offered lay between them like small, fragile objects placed carefully on the desk, and Helena listened in silence, her face composed but her fingers tightening around the ring as if it might otherwise betray her. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, neither accusing nor tender, carrying the weight of someone who has spent years rehearsing what must never again be allowed to hurt. Yes, they hall morning. Raphael postponed the moment, hiding behind emails and calls, letting his assistant stack yet another file on the corner of the desk he was not really seeing. The study, usually his refuge of logic and numbers, felt smaller today, the air more dense, as if the books lining the walls were witnesses waiting to see whether he would choose courage or continue hiding. Outside the windows, the garden was bright and controlled, hedges trimmed to precise shapes, while inside him memories grew wild, climbing over every attempt to concentrate. He had asked Donna Lucia, in his usual even tone, to send Helena to him when she finished with the upstairs rooms, mentioning something vague about a review of her duties. It was the kind of pretext no one would question. Employers summoned maids all the time in that house, for tasks, for complaints, for instructions muttered in low voices that carried the weight of someone else's comfort. Only he knew that this summons had nothing to do with dust or schedules, and everything to do with a thin ring of cheap metal that had turned his well-ordered world slightly off its axis. When the knock finally came, soft and hesitant against the solid wood, his answer caught in his throat a heartbeat before emerging. Helena stepped inside with the contained posture of someone accustomed to entering rooms that were not hers, eyes lowered, hands lightly joined in front of her apron as if making herself smaller might make her safer. The study's lamplight softened the lines of her face, but did nothing to hide the tension in her jaw or the faint swelling of skin roughened by detergents. For a second he saw not the maid standing obediently before his desk, but the girl who had once sat on a cracked concrete step sharing a bruised apple with him, knees touching because there had been nowhere else to sit. Her name rose to his lips before he could dress it in titles, shaped exactly as he used to whisper it in the dark dormitory when the younger children's crying kept her awake. The sound of it, stripped of distance and formality, crossed the space between them and landed on her like an unexpected touch. For a brief, unguarded moment Helena's eyes lifted, and he saw recognition flare there, raw and incredulous, softening the practiced neutrality of her expression. It was gone the next instant, shuttered behind lowered lashes, as she straightened almost imperceptibly and answered him with a single word that placed them back inside their assigned roles. Sir. The title slid between them like a pane of glass, transparent yet impenetrable. Raphael felt the sting of it, not because it was inappropriate, but because of how right it was, how completely it erased the nights when they had been nothing but two children trying to convince each other that hunger and fear were temporary. For a moment he almost retreated into the pretext, reaching for the paper on his desk that listed her assigned rooms, ready to comment on routine, to protect himself with the ordinary. Instead, he drew a breath that seemed to scrape his lungs on the way in and spoke of the one thing neither of them could pretend not to remember. He mentioned the orphanage without embellishment, his voice low and steady, naming the chipped plates, the smell of damp clothes never quite dry, the line of metal beds where sleep came late and left early. He spoke of the nights when her hand had found his under a thin blanket, of the whispered promises that they would grow up, leave that place, and never again feel their stomachs clench with emptiness. His gaze dropped, unbidden, to the ring on her finger, that modest circle that had survived more years than many marriages he had seen announced and dissolved in glossy magazines. He remembered, aloud now, the afternoon he had slipped out through the half-open gate to buy it from a street vendor, trading his fear of punishment for the thrill of placing something that was entirely his choice onto her hand. He repeated the words he had said then, words that had seemed so simple coming from the mouth of a boy who owned nothing. One day, when I'm rich, I'll marry you. Each recollection he offered lay between them like small, fragile objects placed carefully on the desk, and Helena listened in silence, her face composed but her fingers tightening around the ring as if it might otherwise betray her. Ad shared hunger and promises, she conceded, but those words had been spoken by two children who owned nothing, not by the man in an expensive shirt behind the desk and the woman in a uniform standing in front of it. In the orphanage, they had been equals in lack. Here, he was the one who could decide whether lights stayed on or salaries were paid, and she refused to pretend that difference was a detail time had forgotten. Her gaze did not accuse him of betrayal. It simply denied him the comfort of believing that a ring and a few remembered sentences could bridge the years when he had not searched, had not written, had allowed her to become just another anonymous child in his past. Raphael, unsettled, reached for the language he knew now, offering to pay for courses, to recommend her for an office job, to use his influence so she would no longer have to scrub other people's floors. Helena heard in it not generosity but pity, and with her spine straight she refused, saying she wanted only honest work and the basic respect owed to anyone who cleaned these immaculate rooms, then left the study quietly, both of them aware that the old hurt between them had been reopened rather than erased for now. After Helena left the study that morning, closing the heavy door with the same care she used for crystal glasses and porcelain vases, the air in the mansion seemed to change texture. It was a difference almost no one could name directly, but everyone felt somewhere in their bodies, like the pressure shift before a summer storm. Corridors that usually echoed only with footsteps and the soft swish of brooms now carried fragments of lowered voices, conversations that halted the moment a member of the family appeared. In the center of that invisible tremor stood three people who barely spoke to one another about what truly mattered. Beatrice arrived shortly after lunch, as she often did lately, bringing with her the faint perfume of jasmine and the bright insistence of wedding catalogs tucked under her arm. She had called ahead to remind Raphael about a meeting with the decorator, but when she stepped into the front hall and saw that his study door, usually left at least ajar, was firmly shut, something inside her tightened. She exchanged a few polite words with the maid dusting the console table, her smile automatic, all the while aware of the ticking of the clock above the staircase, of seconds stretching longer than they should. When Raphael finally emerged, his face composed but his shoulders carrying a tension that did not belong to contracts or market reports, she noticed immediately that he avoided looking back into the room, as if he feared what might follow him out. Behind him, for an instant before the door closed completely, Beatrice glimpsed Helena standing near the desk, hands joined tightly, her gaze fixed on the floor. That image, her fiancé leaving a private conversation with a maid whose eyes looked as if they had recently held tears, lodged in Beatrice's mind with an insistence that no talk of flower arrangements could dislodge. They walked together toward the sitting room, Beatrice adjusting her pace to his, listening to his courteous responses that said nothing about where his thoughts really were. Only when she mentioned, in a tone meant to sound light, that she had seen he was busy with staff matters earlier, did a flicker cross his expression. He looked away for a heartbeat, studying a painting he had never much liked, and answered with a vague remark about reorganizing cleaning schedules before the wedding. It was plausible, sensible, the kind of explanation any reasonable fiancé should accept, yet the evasiveness underneath it stung more than any honest admission would have. Beatrice felt the old insecurity she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge rise like a tide. The awareness that, for all her beauty and social ease, Raphael's history ran deeper than the years she had shared with him, down into places she had never seen. She told herself she trusted him, that mistrust was beneath her. Yet every time she remembered his eyes sliding past her toward the corridor where Helena had vanished, the taste of doubt returned. Later that afternoon, in the quieter intimacy of tea with his mother, she let the words spill out, framing them as concern for Raphael's well-being, for the stress of the upcoming wedding, but unable to fully hide the sharper edge beneath. She described finding him behind closed doors with the maid, his distracted manner, the ring on the young woman's finger that did not look like a mere accessory, and she watched as the older woman's mouth tightened slightly, the gesture of someone tasting something sour. Raphael's mother had always carried her worries like invisible jewelry, understated but ever-present. They showed now in the way she set her cup down more carefully, in the measured comment that in their world appearances were fragile things, easily shattered by rumor. She did not accuse Helena outright. Instead, she spoke of the need to be prudent, to avoid giving anyone reason to talk, especially when Raphael's story of overcoming poverty made some in their circle already resentful. In that carefully arranged room, lined with family portraits in silver frames, a quiet verdict formed against a woman neither of them had truly looked at beyond her uniform. Outside their conversations, Helena moved through the house as she always did, collecting glasses, straightening pillows, polishing away fingerprints that belonged to other people's lives, unaware of how heavily judgment was beginning to settle over her, like fog seeping under doors. She only knew that the air felt colder when she entered certain rooms, that Beatrice's greetings had acquired a new stiffness, that Raphael's mother now looked past her rather than through her. No one asked if she had sought out that meeting in the study, what had been said there, or how it had felt to hear her childhood turned into a polite topic of conversation. The narrative created upstairs was enough. A maid with a ring and a history they did not know, near a man who was supposed to belong only to their world. In the servants' quarters, however, the story sounded different. The wallpaper there was peeling, the light bulbs yellowed, and the smell of bleach clung to the worn chairs. But there was a kind of solidarity that did not exist beyond the swing door. Donna Lucia, who had worked in houses like this long enough to read emotions in the way a plate was set down or a door was closed, saw Helena return from the study with eyes slightly swollen, her composure intact but her hands shaking just enough to rattle the teaspoons in their drawer. Without questions, without the sharp curiosity of the younger maids, she filled the chipped mug with tea, added extra sugar, and placed it in front of Helena at the end of the counter, then busied herself at the stove, leaving a pocket of respectful silence where comfort could breathe. In that small act, Helena felt seen not as a problem to be solved but as a person allowed to feel hurt without having to justify it. She drank slowly, letting the warmth press back against the cold that had settled inside her since leaving the study, grateful for a kindness that did not demand explanations she could not bear to give. Marcos, the driver, watched these shifts from the threshold between both worlds, standing often near the garage or the kitchen door, where the conversations of employers and employees overlapped just enough for fragments to reach him. He heard Beatrice's tone when she asked for the car grow sharper than before, caught the tail end of a sentence from Raphael's mother about the dangers of familiarity with staff, and later, in the staff room, heard a maid mention that the boss had called Helena to the study alone and she had come back pale. Pieces that meant little in isolation began to form a pattern in his mind, not of scandal as the upstairs feared, but of a story older than this house, one that no one with power seemed interested in hearing. On his next day off, instead of going straight home, Marcos took a bus down to a part of the city where buildings were stained by years of rain and the sidewalks broke beneath too many hurried feet, until he found the old orphanage whose name he had once heard linked to Raphael. The gate sagged on its hinges, paint peeling in long, tired strips, yet inside the courtyard children still played with improvised balls, their shouts echoing off chipped walls that had seen generations pass. Sister Anna, a small woman with tired shoulders and unexpectedly bright eyes, welcomed him with suspicion that softened the moment he mentioned Raphael's surname. At his hesitant questions, she brought out a worn folder and an old photo album, pages filled with images of thin children in donated clothes. Again and again, Marcos saw the same pair appear side by side. A boy with defiant eyes, a girl with a guarded smile, standing a little apart from the others, as if the world had always arranged itself that way around them. Beneath one photograph, their names were neatly written together, Raphael and Helena. Sister Anna spoke quietly of how inseparable they had been, how adoption had taken him away suddenly, how the girl had watched the gate for weeks afterward. Marcos left with photocopies of the photos and a copy of a record page, the papers tucked carefully into an envelope like something breakable. That evening, in the muted light of the garage, with the cars lined up like sleek, sleeping animals, he handed the envelope to Raphael without ceremony, simply saying that some things were easier to see on paper. Alone again in his study, Raphael spread the grainy images and stamped pages on his desk, childhood faces staring up from curled edges and institutional ink. The documents did not tell him anything he did not already know in outline, but they gave shape to what he had tried to compress into memory. Two children clinging to each other on the margins of a system that recorded them as numbers and dates. He understood more sharply that Helena's hurt was not a sudden bruise from their recent conversation, but the layered ache of years spent feeling abandoned and small, of watching others leave while she stayed behind. And as he listened to the distant clatter of plates from the kitchen and the murmur of voices in rooms where judgments were already forming, he felt a weight settle between his ribs and his conscience. Whatever he chose to do, from the wedding plans to the way he treated the maid who still wore his childish promise on her hand, would be interpreted by people who saw only impropriety or condescension, never the full truth of those two children at the edge of the world. The knowledge did not tell him what to do, but it stripped away the illusion that any decision would be simple, leaving him with the quiet certainty that facing the past was no longer something he could postpone or delegate to silence. By the end of that week, the mansion felt to Raphael less like a home and more like an echo chamber. Every look, every unfinished sentence, seemed to bounce off polished walls and return to him slightly distorted. Beatrice watched him with a new, measuring quiet. His mother's compliments came wrapped in cautions about discretion. Helena's footsteps grew almost soundless along the corridors, as if she were trying to erase herself. The study where he had first spoken Helena's name now felt crowded even when empty, thick with the knowledge that anything said behind its door would be pulled apart and reassembled in other people's minds. If he wanted a conversation that belonged only to them, he would have to step outside the house that defined them as employer and maid. So, one restless afternoon, he intercepted her in the pantry while she stacked plates, and in a lower, almost uncertain voice asked if she could meet him at a small cafe down the hill during her break. Suspicion crossed her face, born from years of understanding that nothing good ever came from secret meetings with bosses, but beneath it he saw fatigue, and a stubborn resolve not to let others keep telling her story for her. She hesitated just long enough to remind them both that she had a choice, then nodded and went back to her dishes, leaving him alone with the uneasy feeling that he had just scheduled a meeting with his own past. The cafe was modest, squeezed between a dry cleaner and a locksmith, its faded awning sagging slightly over the pavement. Inside, the air smelled of overused coffee grounds and frying oil. The tiles were chipped near the counter, and the mismatched cups bore the small stains of long service. Here no one cared how much he was worth, and no one called her girl. Raphael waited at a table near the back, jacket folded beside him, sleeves rolled to his forearms as if taking off, clumsily, a layer of authority. When Helena stepped inside and the bell above the door rang its flat little note, she looked for a moment like any tired woman on a short break, though the dark dress still marked her as coming from a house where money touched everything without belonging to her. She sat opposite him, the table suddenly feeling narrower than the distance the years had opened, and for a while they let the clink of spoons and the low radio fill the space between them. When he finally spoke, the words arrived without polish, a plain admission that he had failed her. The apology sounded clumsy in his own ears, but he left it standing, resisting the instinct to cover it with explanations before it could breathe. Only then did he tell her about the day of his adoption as he remembered it from the inside. Adults bustling him along institutional corridors, papers pushed toward signatures, a car waiting with its engine already running. He spoke of being 12, old enough to feel loyalty and fear twisting in his stomach, too young to refuse the hands that guided him into a new surname. In that house, questions about where he came from were received with gentle diversions, and the one time he had said her name aloud his adoptive mother's silence had taught him that certain memories did not match the furniture. Over the years that silence wrapped itself around him like another set of clothes. Instead of writing, instead of returning to the gate to ask, he let work and success pile up over the boy who had promised to come back. Speaking it now, across a scratched table, he heard how thin his reasons sounded, and he did not try to hide that from her. Helena listened with her hands around the warm cup, the bitter coffee gone lukewarm, and nothing in his account surprised her. She had imagined similar scenes on sleepless nights, changing details but keeping the same conclusion. He had left, and he had not returned. When she answered, her voice was steady, more tired than accusing. She told him she had never blamed him for stepping into that car, for wanting a full plate and a bed that was his. Any child under that roof would have done the same. What had lodged inside her like a splinter, she said, was that when he grew into the man whose face appeared in newspapers, whose name opened doors, he had not used even a fragment of that power to look back for the girl who had waited by the orphanage gate. While he learned flight schedules and market indexes, she learned bus lines between distant neighborhoods and the rules of houses where she was dismissed with a nod. Saying it did not undo anything, but it straightened her back, giving shape to a hurt that had too long been carried as vague disappointment. Both of them looked then at the ring on her finger, that stubborn circle of metal that had outlived so many seasons. Raphael said that when he had bought it from a street vendor and slid it onto her hand, he had believed every word of his boyish declaration, convinced that love and determination would be enough to drag them both beyond the orphanage walls. Life, he went on, had shown him that the world was larger and more complicated than two hungry children could guess, and that not all promises survive the weight of time, but he wanted her to know that, in that moment, his feeling had been real. Helena, turning the ring with her thumb, admitted it had kept her from sinking many times, a small resistance against the certainty that she was forgettable, yet it had also tied her to a waiting no one came to end. When they walked back toward the hill, they did so without touching, no longer strangers, not yet anything else, but resolved not to wound each other. As the days after the cafe meeting unfolded, the mansion settled into a strange, wary calm. Raphael and Helena no longer drifted past one another like ghosts pretending not to recognize the shape of a shared past. A brief greeting in the morning, a quiet thank you when she left a tray in his study, the way she now allowed herself to meet his eyes for a second before looking away. These were small changes, almost invisible against the backdrop of polished silver and fresh flowers. Yet in a house where every habit had been worn smooth by repetition, any new gesture, however discreet, drew attention. For Helena, this fragile courtesy felt like a thin bandage over an old scar. It did not undo what had hurt, but it made the days less suffocating. For Raphael, speaking to her without pretending she was just another employee was a tentative truce with his own guilt. They did not talk about the future, did not try to name what they were to each other now. It was enough, for the moment, to coexist without the rawness of accusation. But the mansion was not a sealed world. Whispered phrases escaped the servants' wing, rode down the hill in drivers' conversations, surfaced in hair salons and offices where people loved compact, dramatic stories. The idea that the self-made billionaire lived with a maid from his orphanage who still wore a ring he had once given her was too tempting to stay contained. By the time it reached the sleek glass of the company boardroom, the hesitant truth had hardened into a neat narrative. Directors who had always treated Raphael's childhood as an inspiring paragraph in a profile piece now murmured about imprudence. Over mineral water and financial charts, someone wondered aloud whether it was wise for a man in his position to keep a figure from his formative years so close, particularly with a high-profile wedding approaching. They spoke of exposure and vulnerability, but underneath those polished words lay a simpler discomfort, the suspicion that a man who had risen so far ought to keep his old world at a safer distance. In Beatrice's circles, the same rumors wore different clothes. At lunch, while dresses were discussed and menus compared, a friend joked that she should be careful or she might find a real-life Cinderella hiding among the maids. The table laughed, but Beatrice felt the comment slide beneath her skin. Her engagement ring, which usually rested on her finger like a badge of security, seemed suddenly heavier, as if it too were being weighed and assessed. It was not only jealousy that troubled her, though she could not entirely deny that, but a more complex anxiety, the sense that another woman's story, older and less polished, had entered the frame of her carefully planned future without her consent. In that private place where pride and fear meet, Beatrice convinced herself that it was reasonable, even responsible, to want clarity. So she hired a private investigator known for his discretion, asking him in measured tones to look into the new maid's past, without elaborating on why the answer mattered so much. The report he eventually brought back contained no melodrama, only the bare bones of two childhoods. Pages stamped with the name of an orphanage. Records where Raphael's and Helena's names appeared repeatedly on the same lines. A transfer form showing his adoption by a wealthy couple and her continued stay behind the gates. A handful of faded photographs in which a thin boy and girl stood side by side, shoulders almost touching, their expressions serious in the way of children who have already learned that the world does not promise much. On their own, the documents said only that two abandoned children had clung to each other until life separated them. But facts rarely travel alone. They arrive wrapped in the expectations of those who receive them. By the time Beatrice repeated what she had learned to Raphael's mother, the story had tilted. The ring on Helena's hand was no longer just a relic of a shared childhood, but proof that she had held onto a symbolic claim all these years. Her refusal to gossip became, in Beatrice's telling, a sign not of discretion but of calculation, a strategy of silence. It was easier, in that elegant sitting room, to frame Helena as a woman who had cleverly kept herself positioned near a future billionaire than to consider the possibility that she was simply surviving in the only ways left open to her. In the boardroom, those reframed facts were translated into the formal language of risk management. Some directors warned that keeping Helena on the domestic staff opened the door to malicious speculation, that the press loved blurred lines between charity and desire. Others suggested, with faux reluctance, that investors might interpret Raphael's insistence on protecting an old companion as evidence that he let guilt cloud his judgment. At home, his mother echoed those concerns in softer phrases, telling him she worried for his image, for all he had worked to build. Beneath the concern lay an old fear of hers, that the life she and her husband had offered him could be overshadowed by loyalties forged before their arrival. The message from both spheres was similar, though no one dared speak it bluntly. A man like Raphael could not afford to appear bound to his past by the heart. Downstairs, the same story spread in cruder form, carried on the steam from pots and the clatter of plates. In the servants' dining room, a younger maid whispered that people were saying the boss had promised to marry Helena back in the orphanage, and now was marrying someone else instead. Another nodded and added details she could not possibly know, but which made the tale more compelling. That Helena had returned with the ring on purpose, that she had planned everything. There were sighs of envy, snorts of disbelief, nervous giggles. But what hurt Helena most was the way their eyes changed when they looked at her, as if she had been hiding a role from them. She became, overnight, not just a colleague but a character onto whom they could project their own frustrations and fantasies. No one sat beside her and simply asked what was true. In the quiet of her small room, Helena folded and refolded the same blouse, listening to the murmur of voices seeping through the thin wall, and understood with a tired clarity that if she stayed, the house would not run out of ways to humiliate her gently. It would not happen with shouting or slammed doors, but with closed ones, with withdrawn trust, with the slow erosion of her dignity. The next day, on her break, she wrote her resignation in neat, careful handwriting on a single sheet of paper. She thanked the family for the opportunity and stated plainly that she did not wish to be the source of misunderstandings, broken engagements, or conflict. She wanted to leave, the letter said, while she still could do so with her head held high. When Raphael read those lines in his study, the room seemed to shrink around him. The same walls that had witnessed their first painful conversation now witnessed another failure, quieter but no less sharp. His first impulse was to refuse, to march into the next board meeting and make it clear that their fear did not rule his house, to call his mother and Beatrice and tell them that they were wrong about Helena, about what she wanted, about who she was. But beneath the surge of defiance, another truth pressed against his chest. Helena had not asked him to fight this battle. More than once, she had told him that what she wanted was not rescue, but respect. Forcing her to stay in a place that had turned her into a rumor would be another way of using his power to override her choices, even if his intention was to protect. So, with a heaviness that reminded him of leaving the orphanage all those years ago, he accepted the resignation exactly as she had written it. When his mother suggested that it might be prudent to note in the records that the maid had been dismissed for cause, he shook his head and answered quietly that Helena had left because they did not deserve her loyalty. That afternoon, Helena packed her few belongings into a small, worn bag. A change of clothes, a photograph of her foster aunt, the bit of savings she had managed to put aside. The ring stayed on her finger, not as a ticket into Raphael's world, but as a stubborn witness to everything she had survived before and after him. In the kitchen, Donna Lucia embraced her without asking for explanations, offering the kind of wordless solidarity that cannot be bought. Marcos gave her a brief, steady nod that said more than a speech. Helena crossed the threshold of the service door with steady steps, feeling the cool metal of the handle one last time before stepping into the late afternoon light. She carried her bag, her silence, and the unbroken line of her own pride. Upstairs, Raphael watched her figure grow smaller from an unlit window, resisting the urge to call out. He understood, with a mixture of sorrow and reluctant respect, that if another chapter was ever to exist between them, it would have to begin from this distance she had chosen, not from the noise of other people's fears. Weeks passed after Helena's departure, but in Raphael's world time seemed to move without weight. Like pages turning in a book he was no longer reading. The mansion functioned as always. Flowers arrived at dawn, the housekeeper distributed lists of tasks, the chef discussed menus with the nutritionist, security checked cameras and gates. Yet a thin emptiness threaded through the routines, as if a note had gone missing from a piece of music only he could hear. He still left early for the office, still returned late, still responded to emails faster than anyone else on his team, but the satisfaction that used to rise in him when a deal closed or a strategy worked had gone flat. The graphs in the boardroom climbed as expected, dark lines against white paper, and directors nodded approvingly, but Raphael felt detached, watching his own success from a few steps away. At night he walked through the echoing corridors of the house and sometimes caught himself listening for the soft, measured footsteps that no longer crossed the marble, for the quiet clink of cleaned glasses in the kitchen. When he opened his study door now, it was only to find polished emptiness and a stack of documents that promised distraction without relief. Beatrice saw the change long before anyone spoke of it aloud. She arrived with folders of wedding details, sat across from him while caterers sent updated menus and decorators proposed centerpieces, and watched his eyes drift to the window or the floor. His answers were correct but hollow, as if he were reading lines in a play that had stopped making sense to him. More than once she suggested postponing a meeting or taking a few days together away from the city, hoping that outside the mansion, far from the shadows she felt but could not name, he might look at her the way he had at the beginning. Instead, he repeated that he was busy, that the merger demanded his full attention, that this phase would pass. The half-truths accumulated like dust in corners no one cleaned. He admitted his fatigue but never the true source of it, acknowledged pressure but not the guilt that pressed behind his ribs whenever he thought of the maid leaving with a small bag and a straight back. One afternoon, sitting opposite him at the long dining table covered in fabric samples, Beatrice realized with a clarity that both hurt and steadied her that she was planning a celebration around a man whose heart was elsewhere, not necessarily in love with another woman, but anchored in questions he would not share. She had been raised to recognize when a negotiation was no longer to her advantage, whether in business or in emotion. Keeping her dignity meant not waiting to be quietly sidelined. So she removed her engagement ring, placed it gently on the table between the catalogs, and told him, in a calm voice that trembled only at the edges, that she would not build a marriage on half-light and omissions. He did not argue. The absence of protest confirmed what she already knew, and within days the families were informed that the wedding was off, smoothed over with explanations about timing and priorities that fooled no one who had seen the distance in Raphael's eyes. Far from that world of managed statements, Helena's life narrowed to simpler, more immediate concerns. After leaving the mansion, she found work through a neighbor at a small family-run inn in a quieter part of the city, far from the glass towers and guarded gates of the hillside. The building was old, its facade patched and repainted in places, the wooden stairs creaking under each step, but the reception desk was polished daily, and potted plants fought valiantly to bring life to the narrow lobby. The owners, a couple who lived in a room behind the kitchen, treated Helena without grandeur or condescension. They called her by her name, asked after her aunt's health, and sat with her at the same table at the end of long days, sharing stew and stories. The work was still hard. Changing bedding, scrubbing bathrooms, carrying laundry baskets that left red marks on her arms. Yet there was a different air here, an understanding that people were not invisible just because they changed sheets. Guests sometimes thanked her directly, looking her in the eye, and although she often shrugged off their appreciation, it settled somewhere gentle inside her, slowly easing the tightness that had become normal. At night, in the narrow bed the inn provided, she slept a little deeper. The ring remained on her finger, less a chain to an old disappointment now than a quiet reminder of how far she had walked since those days in the orphanage courtyard. She thought of Raphael less often, and when she did the memories came without the sharpness of fresh hurt, like photographs in a box she could open or close at will. Meanwhile, in an office high above the city, Raphael signed documents with efficient strokes and measured out his days in meetings, but the numbers no longer anchored him. One gray morning, after catching his reflection in the boardroom glass and seeing not a decisive executive but a man perpetually on the verge of leaving the room, he made a different kind of decision. Instead of heading home after work, he asked Marcos to drive him to a neighborhood he had not visited since childhood. The streets there were narrower than he remembered, the buildings closer together, laundry hanging from windows like faded flags. When the car stopped in front of the orphanage gate, Raphael felt his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with business. The gate itself seemed smaller, its paint more peeled, but the outline was the same as the one that had framed his last view of Helena all those years ago. Inside, the courtyard still echoed with children's voices, the rhythm of a ball against concrete, a song shouted rather than sung. Sister Anna came to meet him, older, her hair whiter, but her eyes immediately recognizing the boy in the man. She led him through corridors that smelled of detergent and soup, to a small office where she opened a drawer and took out a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. These, she said, were letters he had written as a teenager, addressed to Helena and to the orphanage, letters he had never mailed or had half-finished and left behind during visits he barely remembered. His handwriting, uneven and earnest, filled the pages with apologies and promises to return. Alongside them were notes recording how, for months after his adoption, Helena had watched each car that stopped outside, smoothing her hair, straightening her clothes, only to turn away when strangers stepped out instead of him. Sister Anna's voice was gentle, not accusing, as she recounted how the girl had eventually stopped waiting at the gate, but had never removed the ring. Raphael stood in the doorway of the dormitory where rows of metal beds still lined the walls and felt the weight of the past settle more honestly on his shoulders. In the courtyard, where a scraggly tree cast thin shade, he recognized the exact spot where he had once placed a cheap ring on a thin finger, believing that gesture alone could rewrite their fates. Guilt washed through him, but this time it did not paralyze. It clarified. Simply feeling sorry, he understood now, changed nothing for the children still sleeping in these beds, or for the woman who had walked away from his house with her dignity intact. As he left the orphanage, the sounds of play fading behind him, he carried with him not only memories but a quieter, firmer resolve. If he went to Helena again, it would not be as a millionaire hoping to erase a debt with money or as a man bound to a boy's promise, but as someone finally willing to expose his own failures and build whatever might come next on truth rather than avoidance. Marcos had needed only a street name and a description of the neighborhood to do what Raphael could not bring himself to ask anyone else to do. A few discreet questions, a short list of possible places, and then one quiet confirmation. A small family inn on a side street where the sidewalks were cracked and flower pots balanced on windowsills like small acts of resistance. When Raphael stepped out of the car that afternoon, leaving the polished leather and tinted glass behind, the air felt different from the hill above the city. Here it smelled of frying oil, laundry soap, and the faint sweetness of guava from a street cart at the corner. The inn's facade was narrow, painted a gentler shade of blue that the sun had already begun to fade, but swept clean. A handwritten sign in the window announced vacancies and a modest daily rate. For a moment he simply stood on the pavement, feeling the contrast between his tailored jacket and the worn stone under his shoes, acutely aware of how easily he could have been one of the guests here in another life, or one of the boys running past, not the man arriving with the weight of two worlds on his shoulders. Inside, the lobby was small but orderly. A low desk held a ledger, a jar of sweets, and a bell that had lost some of its shine. A fan turned slowly on the ceiling, pushing warm air around. Somewhere down the hallway, he heard the rhythm of a mop swishing along tile, a bucket being dragged, doors opening and closing with the gentler thud of old wood. When the owner, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and kind hands, recognized the name Marcos had given over the phone, she nodded toward the stairs without curiosity, as if understanding that some visitors came in search of people rather than beds. On the second floor, the corridor was narrow and lined with doors marked by numbers that had been repainted so many times the wood underneath bulged slightly. Raphael followed the sound of cleaning, the soft scrape of a brush against tile, the faint clink of bottles. He found her in one of the rooms, standing by an open window stripped of curtains, hair tied back, sleeves rolled above her forearms as she scrubbed the bathroom sink. The late afternoon light lay on her face without mercy, highlighting the small lines of fatigue near her eyes, the firmness of a mouth that had learned not to complain. For a second he only watched, struck by how completely she seemed to belong to this place now, not as a figure from his past, but as part of its present, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had accepted the shape of her days and filled it with quiet competence. When she noticed him in the doorway, the brush paused mid-circle. Surprise flared across her features, chased almost immediately by wariness. The last time she had seen him, she had left his house with a resignation letter and the certainty that whatever bound them was better kept at a distance. The sight of him here, in this room with its single narrow bed and chipped wardrobe, felt like an intrusion from another planet. She straightened, wiped her hands on her apron as if removing invisible dust, and greeted him not with the familiarity of the orphanage, nor with the deferential sir of the mansion, but with a neutral politeness that acknowledged his presence without inviting anything from it. The silence that followed was heavy with all the versions of this meeting that could have been. Accusations, pleas, awkward small talk. Instead, he stepped inside slowly, closing the door only partway behind him, leaving a slice of corridor visible as if to prove he did not intend secrets. He admitted, in words that sounded more natural here than in his study, that he had been wrong. Wrong to let his mother, his fiancée, the board, and even the servants' whispers shape the way he acted toward her. Wrong to stay quiet while others painted her as a threat, as if she had engineered her way into his life rather than simply trying to earn a living. Wrong, above all, to allow fear of scandal and appearances to weigh more than his knowledge of who she had been as a child and the woman she had become. He did not try to excuse himself with shareholders or the press this time. He named his fear honestly, the way someone finally pulls back a curtain on a room they have left dark too long. Helena listened, her back still straight, a damp cloth hanging forgotten from one hand. Apologies, she had learned, were easier to utter than to live by. Yet there was something different in his tone now, a stripped-down sincerity that did not hide behind the language of opportunities and debt. He was not offering to fix her life, she realized, but to acknowledge where he had let the structure of his own life crush her without protest. When he said that watching children in the orphanage beds had forced him to confront a part of himself he had kept quiet even from his own reflection, she believed him, not because of the words themselves but because of the way his shoulders lowered, as if he were finally setting down a weight that did not belong to her alone. Then, carefully, he shifted from apology to proposal. He described his visit to the orphanage, the peeling paint, the metal beds that might well be the same ones they had slept on, the overworked staff trying to stretch too few resources across too many needs. He spoke not of building a gleaming monument to his generosity, but of repairing what already existed. Fixing roofs that leaked onto children's pillows, improving the kitchen, creating spaces where homework could be done without 3 conversations overlapping at once. To do it well, he said, he needed more than an architect and a checkbook. He needed someone who knew from the inside what abandonment felt like, what had hurt and what had helped. Someone who could look at blueprints and ask the questions no consultant from his world would think to ask. He was offering her not charity but work shaped by her experience with a formal contract, a salary aligned with external advisors, and real authority to make decisions rather than just carry out orders. The words sat between them, unexpected and heavy. Helena felt a familiar instinct rise, to refuse anything that smelled of rescue, to defend the fragile independence she had rebuilt since leaving his house. Another world where he controlled the budget, the timelines, and the final say threatened to recreate, in more benevolent terms, the same imbalance that had hurt her before. She imagined herself once again being the poor girl in the roomful of well-dressed people, brought in as an example, a justification, or worse, a decoration for someone else's generosity. But alongside that fear, another image surfaced, stubborn and clear. Rows of metal beds, the cold of orphanage mornings, the way kindness had sometimes arrived in small, clumsy gestures from people who knew exactly what it meant to have no one. The idea of walking into that building not as a forgotten child but as someone who could alter its walls and routines stirred something deeper than pride. Purpose. She let the possibilities unfold slowly in her mind. She could help choose the colors that would greet children's eyes, insist on doors that closed properly, suggest a small corner for books that didn't smell of mildew, ensure that the next Helena who lay awake there would at least feel that someone had thought about her comfort. The risk of stepping back into a space where Raphael's decisions could affect her again was real, but so was the opportunity to turn their shared wound into something that might protect others. When she finally answered, her conditions were clear. If she accepted, it would be as a professional, not as a charity case brought in to ease his conscience. She wanted a written agreement, a defined role, the freedom to disagree without fearing dismissal, and above all, no confusion between this work and whatever unresolved feelings lingered from their past. He would have to accept that outside the orphanage meetings, her life was her own, that he had no claim on her time or her heart. Raphael listened and, this time, did not rush to reassure with grand gestures. He recognized in her terms the same pride that had led her to refuse his previous offers, only now anchored in a clearer self-worth. He agreed not as a favor, but because he understood that anything less would repeat their old mistakes. When they shook hands, her palm still slightly damp from cleaning products, his calloused from years of handshakes in boardrooms, the touch was brief but steady. It was not the closing of a deal in the way he knew from business, nor the sealing of a romantic promise they were not ready to revive, but the quiet beginning of a partnership neither of them would have imagined years ago on the orphanage steps. As Helena returned to her cleaning and Raphael walked back down the creaking stairs into the fading light of the street, both carried with them a cautious awareness that this new arrangement could reopen wounds or help heal them. For now, it was enough that they had chosen it with open eyes and spoken terms, no longer pretending their lives had not once been intertwined, and no longer allowing others to decide what that history meant. The first weeks of work at the orphanage felt less like a charity project and more like surgery on a living body, every blow of the hammer exposing old fractures beneath flaking paint. Trucks squeezed through the sagging gate, dumping sand and bricks where children used to play, and the familiar smell of boiled beans mingled with dust, wet cement, and the cigarette smoke of tired workers. In the middle of that noise walked Raphael and Helena, clipboards in hand, the outlines of their new roles giving structure to a bond that still did not know what name to claim. He discussed deadlines with the architect, asked for revised budgets, checked messages from his office. She ran fingers along damp walls, noted where wind slipped under warped windows, thought of cold nights and thin blankets. When the architect proposed opening the entrance with glass and polished stone to impress donors, Raphael nodded automatically, already translating design into spreadsheets, but Helena imagined muddy shoes, timid glances, children afraid to touch anything that shone too much. She suggested a strong mat, hooks for coats, a bench where someone could sit to untie wet laces, details so small they did not appear on drawings but lived stubbornly in her memory. Their disagreements began politely, almost shyly, then sharpened as they moved from room to room, arguing over whether money should go to insulation or facade, to computers or shelves, to security cameras or a quiet study corner. Raphael, shaped by years of decisions measured in efficiency and return, saw the building as a long-term asset that needed to be modern, durable, worthy of photographs in annual reports. Helena, whose childhood had been spent shivering under thin covers and pretending not to hear other children crying in the dark, insisted that warm beds, doors that closed properly, and a room for homework would change lives more quietly but more deeply. Once, in the half-demolished dormitory, their voices rose enough that a nearby worker paused with his drill midair, listening as Raphael defended investing in computers while Helena refused to give up on sturdy desks and individual lamps. In the end, after phone calls and a reluctant discount from a supplier, they found space in the budget for both, and the compromise, though exhausting, left each with a new respect for the other's stubbornness. Where they did not clash, they discovered how well their skills fit together, like mismatched pieces that only made sense when pressed into the same frame. Raphael could read contracts and quotations as if they were open books, spotting hidden fees, inflated transport costs, and vague delivery dates that later became excuses. Helena could read faces and tones, distinguishing between empty promises and simple shyness. During one tense conversation about mattress quality, it was not Raphael's threat to cancel the order but Helena's calm description of a child's back aching on metal springs that finally made the supplier swallow his protests and agree to better material. The children navigated the construction site with the wary agility of those used to adapting, their toys forever displaced by ladders, their games rewritten to include piles of sand as mountains and stacks of tiles as fortresses. Helena became their anchor almost without noticing, the person they ran to when noise and dust were too much, when a knee was scraped or a secret felt too heavy to keep. She corrected them when they overstepped, made them line up to wash hands before snacks, but also listened seriously to their questions about whether the new rooms would be warmer, whether the beds would still creak at night. At first Raphael watched from doorways, more comfortable with budgets than with small hands pulling at his sleeve, but one stubborn boy insisted on drawing him into their orbit by sheer persistence. The child deliberately kicked a ball too near a fresh-painted wall, then froze in anticipation, and instead of shouting, Raphael picked up the ball, knelt so they were at eye level, and asked about the match. What began as a reprimand became a conversation about goals, teams, and favorite players, soon surrounded by other children, until Raphael found himself sitting on the dusty floor, tie loosened, listening to dreams that sounded painfully like his own once had. From the doorway Helena watched, arms folded loosely, and in the way he nodded seriously at each improbable plan she glimpsed the boy who had once promised her the world with empty pockets and absolute conviction. Resentment did not vanish. Years do not dissolve in a few afternoons, but something in her guardedness relaxed, making room for a more complicated feeling that mixed anger with respect and, reluctantly, affection. When Raphael's mother finally accepted his invitation to visit, she arrived with the caution of someone stepping into foreign territory, careful where she placed her heels among cables and paint buckets. She had prepared herself to confront a spectacle of vanity or improvised generosity, but instead she found her son with rolled-up sleeves, hair dusted with plaster, explaining to a shy girl how the new heating would keep the rooms warmer. Nearby, Helena was showing two boys how to fold their new blankets, turning the task into a game, and for a moment Raphael's mother simply watched them together, sensing an ease and shared focus she had never quite seen in boardrooms or fundraising galas. Her misgivings did not disappear, but they shifted, less about scandal and more about the unsettling realization that this other woman, once a nameless maid in her house, had helped awaken in Raphael a part of himself she had not been able to reach. As the building neared completion, paint drying and furniture arriving in battered trucks, Raphael and Helena's days settled into something almost gentle. Shared coffees and easy smiles tempered by a mutual caution about confusing gratitude with love. They laughed about obstinate suppliers, recalled the old leaking roof in passing, then returned to budgets, letting affection grow at its own unhurried, careful pace together. On the morning the orphanage reopened, the courtyard seemed unfamiliar, dressed in colors and sounds it had rarely known. Banners of white cloth fluttered from the windows, clumsily painted letters of thanks wavering in the soft breeze, while a borrowed sound system crackled with cheerful music that did little to hide its age. Children ran in loose circles around the newly painted benches, their shoes tracing dusty arcs on the concrete, faces bright with a joy untouched by budgets or construction schedules. Helena stood near the edge of the gathering, close enough to feel the pulse of celebration, far enough that no one ushered her toward the front. The building behind her smelled of fresh paint and new wood, but beneath it lingered the faint trace of detergent and metal, a ghost of the dormitories where she and Raphael had once whispered themselves to sleep. Now the beds were solid, the blankets thick, the windows sealed properly. A small room with bright tables waited to become a study corner, and in each choice Helena recognized pieces of her own story, translated into brick and fabric and light. Donors, local officials, volunteers, and curious neighbors filled the mismatched chairs facing a makeshift stage where a microphone had been set up. Raphael stood there now, adjusting the cable with a familiar gesture, jacket abandoned despite the formality of the occasion. His sleeves rolled as if his body finally accepted that this work could not be done from behind a desk. When he began to speak, the speakers swallowed his first words in a burst of static, but the feeling behind them carried clearly enough for Helena to follow every nuance. He talked briefly about numbers, how many children could be housed now, how much had been invested, how long the repairs should last, because he knew that was the language his guests expected. Then his tone shifted, the cadence losing its boardroom polish as he spoke about nights when hunger stretched time, when the sound of another child's breathing was the only proof that the world extended beyond your own fear. Every child, he said, regardless of the street they were born on, deserved more than mere survival. They deserved someone who refused to forget them once the gates closed behind a departing car. At that, his eyes, just for a heartbeat, found Helena's at the edge of the crowd, and she felt both the ache of what had not been done and the sincerity of what he was trying to repair now. She lowered her gaze to steady herself, the sunlight catching the worn ring on her finger and drawing an unexpected spark from its simple band. The applause that followed was uneven but genuine, the kind that begins cautiously and grows as people recognize something of their own history in the words they have heard. Children wriggled through the formalities of ribbon cutting, craning their necks to be first up the new stairs, and when the doors finally opened their shouts filled the corridors, bouncing off freshly painted walls that, for once, seemed to welcome rather than merely contain them. Helena walked beside a cluster of younger ones, pointing out the reading corner, the softer pillows, the place where they could hang their drawings, her heart tugging each time a small face lit up with incredulity at some simple comfort she herself had once longed for. Raphael moved among officials and neighbors, answering questions, shaking hands, but his attention kept circling back to her, to the way she balanced firmness and warmth as naturally as breathing. As the sun slid lower and the crowd thinned to staff and lingering guests, he caught Helena's eye again and, with a small tilt of his head, asked silently for a moment apart. She hesitated, instinctively aware that whatever he wished to say would not concern invoices or delivery dates, then nodded and followed him along a narrow path at the edge of the property, where a strip of stubborn grass and a worn bench offered a pocket of shade. The noise of the courtyard softened behind them, becoming a distant murmur, as if the past and the future were holding their breath to give them room. Standing there, Raphael seemed for a moment both younger and older, the boy who had once believed a cheap ring and a bold sentence could shield them from injustice. and the man who had learned how little protection words alone can offer when life intervenes. He told her this without flourish, acknowledging that his childhood vow had been sincere yet naive, born from hunger so deep it had confused love with escape. Now, he said, he understood that no declaration, however fervent, could erase the years in which she had felt forgotten or the compromises they had each made to survive. What he could offer was different. Not redemption for the boy he had been, but a future in which the man he was now chose her openly, not as repayment or atonement, but out of a love that had grown slowly in shared work, in disagreements over mattresses and lamps, in the way she kept forcing him to look beyond figures on a page. He confessed that he had fallen in love with the woman she had become, stubborn, cautious, fiercely protective of her dignity, rather than with a memory preserved like a folded photograph in his mind. Then, finally, he placed the choice where it had never truly rested before, telling her that whatever answer she gave, whether she agreed to share her life with him or preferred to keep their bond within the walls of this work, his respect for her would remain unchanged. Helena listened to the quiet between them, measuring the distance between pity and the love she now recognized in his eyes, and chose. She said yes, not to repay a debt but to walk beside him by choice, the old ring on her finger rekindled as a sign of their equal, shared beginning together now.